The last letter I ever got from our homeowners association showed up on a Tuesday afternoon. Another bright white envelope with another bright red stamp screaming final notice. Except this time, I barely looked at it before setting it on the kitchen counter because by then I already knew exactly what it would say. $50 more. Another violation. Another reminder that in the little neighborhood where I thought I'd finally found some peace after years of saving, somebody had decided my life needed to be measured with a ruler and a clipboard. Funny thing is, less than 3 weeks after that envelope arrived, the woman who signed every one of those notices wasn't walking around inspecting people's flower beds anymore. She was walking into a federal courthouse with her hands cuffed behind her back. My name is Daniel Carter, and when I bought my place in Cedar Ridge Estates, I honestly believe the HOA was one of the selling points. The lawns looked clean, the sidewalks were spotless, the entrance sign had fresh flowers every season, and every real estate brochure talked about protecting property values, like it was the greatest promise ever made. I figured a few reasonable rules couldn't hurt anybody. Keep the yard maintained. Don't leave junk outside. Be respectful to your neighbors. I could live with that. What I didn't realize was that rules are only as reasonable as the people enforcing them. And once Melissa Harper became president of the board, those rules stopped being guidelines and turned into weapons. At first it almost seemed funny. $25 because my trash bin stayed beside the garage for 40 minutes after pickup while I was stuck in traffic. $35 because my mailbox had a tiny scratch that honestly looked like something only a microscope could find. Then $50 because my driveway had visible oil staining, even though it had rained the night before and there wasn't a single stain left by the next morning. Every week, there was another letter, another photo, another violation. According to Melissa, my welcome mat wasn't the approved earth tone color listed somewhere in the community handbook. My pickup truck was supposedly parked too close to the edge of my own driveway. One afternoon, she even claimed my recycling container was creating visual clutter because it could supposedly be seen from the sidewalk through a gap in my side gate. You couldn't make this stuff up if you tried. The strangest part wasn't even the fines. It was Melissa herself. Every morning around 8:30 she'd cruise slowly through the neighborhood in a little white golf cart with a clipboard resting across the steering wheel and a digital camera hanging around her neck like she worked for National Geographic. Only instead of photographing wildlife, she photographed basketball hoops left in driveways, faded shutters, garden hoses, kids' bicycles, flower pots, and anything else she thought could squeeze another payment out of somebody. You'd see curtains move whenever that golf cart rolled down the street because everyone knew she was looking for someone to make an example of. Neighbors stopped chatting in their front yards. Kids rushed to put scooters away. People actually apologized to each other for things that weren't bothering anyone simply because nobody wanted another letter in the mailbox. Looking back now, that's exactly how people slowly surrender their freedom, not through one giant act of control, but through hundreds of tiny ones until everyone starts policing themselves. My own breaking point came the day after Christmas. I had been pulling 12-hour shifts because the accounting firm I worked for was drowning in year-end financial reports, and honestly the last thing on my mind was climbing onto a ladder to remove Christmas lights before breakfast. They were still hanging neatly along the roofline, not flashing, not bothering anybody, just quietly sitting there waiting for the weekend. That afternoon, another envelope arrived. $200. Holiday decorations remaining after the approved deadline. I stared at that number for almost a full minute before grabbing my keys and driving straight to Melissa's house. I wasn't looking for a fight. I honestly believed we could have a normal conversation. She opened the door wearing a perfect smile that somehow felt colder than if she'd been yelling. I explained I'd been working long hours, that I'd have everything taken down within a day or two, and asked if she could simply waive the fine this once. She folded her arms, tilted her head just enough to make it clear she was enjoying herself, and said, "Rules don't take vacations, Daniel. Maybe next year you'll manage your time better." Then she smiled. Actually smiled, before quietly closing the door in my face. I stood there for several seconds listening to the deadbolt click, and instead of feeling angry, I felt curious. Something about the whole thing suddenly stopped making sense. Melissa never seemed excited about improving the neighborhood. She seemed excited about collecting money. Every board meeting included another expensive improvement project: decorative lighting, upgraded irrigation, premium landscaping packages, monument signs, security upgrades. Always another reason dues had to increase. Always another explanation about why the community needed to spend more. As I drove home that afternoon, one thought kept replaying in my head over and over. Maybe the fines were never the real business. Maybe they were simply keeping everyone distracted from something much bigger. And if there was one thing my career had taught me, it was that whenever money starts moving in strange directions, somebody usually benefits. I had spent years following financial trails that other people overlooked, and for the first time since moving into Cedar Ridge Estates, I realized I might need to start following one in my own neighborhood. Before I tell you what I found, let me explain something that a lot of homeowners never realize until it's too late. According to standard procedure, an HOA isn't supposed to operate like one person's private business. Board members have a fiduciary duty, which basically means they're legally expected to put the community's interests ahead of their own. From a legal perspective, homeowners usually have the right to inspect many financial records, contracts, and meeting minutes, and that's exactly how questionable spending often comes to light. Now here's where it gets interesting. This is a psychological trap. When someone gets away with enforcing tiny, unreasonable rules over and over, people stop asking bigger questions because they're too busy worrying about the next violation letter. Fear becomes routine, routine becomes silence, and silence creates the perfect environment for abuse of power. The lesson here is, if someone seems obsessed with collecting every little dollar, don't just watch where the money comes from. Watch where the money goes. That's the question I finally decided to answer, and once I started following the numbers, the entire picture changed. The morning after I decided to follow the money, I stopped thinking like a frustrated homeowner and started thinking like the forensic accountant I'd been for nearly 15 years. People imagine financial fraud as something dramatic, secret meetings in dark parking lots or stacks of cash hidden in basements, but that's rarely how it works. Most fraud hides in plain sight, buried inside ordinary paperwork that nobody bothers to read. So I submitted a formal written request to inspect the HOA's financial records. I kept it polite, quoted the governing documents, cited the applicable homeowner inspection rights, and waited. 3 days later, Melissa emailed back saying the records were being reorganized. A week after that, she claimed the management company was updating the files. Then it was vacation schedules, computer issues, missing invoices. Every excuse sounded different, but they all pointed toward the same thing. Someone was buying time. I almost laughed because delaying a records request is one of the oldest tricks in the book. Eventually, several heavy boxes appeared outside my front door with a short note saying everything I requested had been provided. I carried them inside, brewed an entire pot of coffee, cleared off my dining room table, opened my laptop, and went to work. At first, nothing looked unusual. Bank statements, maintenance invoices, landscaping contracts, insurance renewals, reserve studies, thousands of pages that would have bored almost anyone else to sleep. But after a few hours, little patterns began appearing. Every major landscaping project over the previous 3 years had been awarded to Green Horizon Property Services. The entrance monument renovation had gone to Summit Access Solutions. The playground replacement had been completed by Evergreen Recreation Group. 3 different companies, 3 different industries, except the mailing addresses caught my attention. 2 shared the same office suite. Another used a mailbox service less than 2 blocks away. That alone wasn't proof of anything, but it was enough to keep digging. Public business records are amazing things when you know where to look. Within 2 evenings, I had ownership filings spread across my dining room table with sticky notes connecting names, addresses, and registered agents. Green Horizon wasn't really owned by an independent contractor. It was controlled by Melissa's husband through a holding company. Summit Access listed her brother as the managing member. Evergreen's operations manager turned out to be her adult son. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the wall for a long minute because conflicts of interest aren't automatically crimes if they're fully disclosed and properly approved, but I couldn't find a single disclosure anywhere in the board minutes. Not one vote documenting the relationships. Not one competitive bidding process. Not one explanation to homeowners. That's when I started comparing invoice amounts with market pricing. The numbers were almost insulting. Decorative shrubs billed at 4 times their wholesale cost. Mulch deliveries that exceeded what the property could physically hold. Security gates priced like they had been built for a military installation instead of a suburban entrance. A playground that supposedly required specialized engineering despite being almost identical to one installed in a neighboring community for less than a quarter of the price. Every page I turned raised another question. Every spreadsheet uncovered another inconsistency. Then I noticed something that completely changed the picture. Several invoices included consulting fees paid to separate companies that had no employees, no equipment, no websites, and no visible business activity. Money flowed from the HOA to contractors. Then portions flowed back out through these consulting companies, finally landing in accounts connected to people already tied to Melissa's family. It wasn't one suspicious payment. It was a repeating system. The same percentages, the same timing, the same cycle over and over. By the end of the week, my dining room looked like something out of a detective movie with folders, color-coded notes, highlighted bank records, corporate filings, and handwritten timelines covering every available surface. I wasn't trying to prove revenge anymore. I was trying to understand the full picture because the more I found, the less this looked like sloppy management and the more it resembled an organized scheme. I calculated that homeowners had paid well over $200,000 beyond reasonable market costs during the previous several years. That money could have repaired sidewalks, lowered dues, improved reserves, or simply stayed in residents' pockets. Instead, it appeared to circle back into the same network of related businesses. I thought about the retired couple down the street who skipped vacations because dues kept increasing. I thought about the young family that sold their house after falling behind on assessments. Suddenly, those ridiculous $50 violation notices seemed almost insignificant compared to what had really been happening. I organized every document into labeled binders, prepared comparison spreadsheets, built a timeline showing contract approvals alongside ownership records, and wrote a summary explaining exactly how each payment connected to the next. When I finished, I wasn't carrying accusations. I was carrying evidence that deserved an independent review. The following Monday, I scheduled a meeting with the appropriate federal authorities and handed over everything I'd assembled. The investigator spent several quiet minutes flipping through the first binder before looking up and asking one simple question. "Did you put all of this together yourself?" I nodded. He asked me to wait in the lobby. 15 minutes later, 2 more investigators walked into the room carrying notepads. They wanted clarification on transaction dates, corporate registrations, contract approvals, and payment flows. I answered every question the same way I'd answer an audit. Slowly, carefully, and only with facts I could support. When I finally stood to leave, one of them thanked me and said they would take it from there. I honestly expected months of silence because that's usually how complicated financial investigations work. Instead, less than a week later, several neighbors called saying investigators had been visiting the management office asking for additional records. Rumors spread through Cedar Ridge faster than summer thunderstorms. Melissa acted as if nothing had changed. At the next monthly board meeting, she stood confidently behind the podium, wearing the same polished smile I'd seen dozens of times before. She thanked everyone for attending, spoke about protecting property values, and introduced yet another proposal. A $70,000 beautification project that she described as absolutely essential for maintaining community standards. I sat quietly in the third row listening as homeowners prepared to vote on spending even more money. Then the meeting room doors opened. Conversation stopped almost instantly as several investigators walked inside, identified themselves, and calmly announced they were executing authorized search warrants related to an ongoing financial investigation. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Melissa's confident expression disappeared almost immediately. She looked around the room as if expecting someone to explain away the situation, but nobody moved. One investigator requested access to board records while another began speaking privately with the property manager. Homeowners stared at one another in disbelief. The same neighbors who had spent years worrying about crooked parking jobs and faded mailboxes were suddenly watching the people who enforced those rules answer questions about contracts, invoices, and financial records. In that moment, everyone finally realized the tiny violations had never been the real story. They had simply been noise covering something far more important. The months that followed moved much slower than the excitement of that meeting, because real investigations usually do. Auditors reviewed records, investigators interviewed witnesses, attorneys sorted through contracts, and every financial transaction was examined one line at a time. Eventually, the findings became public, and they painted a picture that was every bit as troubling as I had feared. The investigation concluded that multiple contracts had been awarded without proper disclosure of family relationships. Costs had repeatedly exceeded reasonable market pricing without adequate justification, and HOA funds had been directed through a network of related businesses in ways that violated both the association's governing responsibilities and the law. Criminal charges were filed against several individuals involved in the scheme, while civil proceedings focused on recovering money for the community. Watching those announcements on the evening news didn't feel like victory. If I'm being honest, it felt more like relief. For years, so many of us had believed we were the problem. We thought maybe our grass wasn't green enough. Maybe our mailbox really was the wrong color. Maybe we should have parked straighter or brought our trash cans inside 5 minutes earlier. Looking back, I realized those little violation letters did something far more damaging than collect money. They slowly convinced decent people that they deserved to be constantly criticized. Once the investigation became public, neighbors who had barely spoken to one another started having conversations again. Some admitted they'd been too intimidated to challenge the board. Others confessed they'd simply assumed someone else was paying attention. A retired teacher down the street told me she'd paid every fine without question because she didn't want to be labeled difficult. A young couple said they almost sold their home because they felt like they could never satisfy the endless stream of new rules. Hearing those stories reminded me that financial harm is only part of what happens when leadership loses sight of its responsibilities. Trust disappears first, and rebuilding it takes much longer than balancing a budget. According to standard procedure, the new board immediately ordered independent financial audits, adopted stricter conflict of interest policies, required multiple competitive bids for significant projects, and made meeting minutes and financial reports easily available to every homeowner. From a legal perspective, transparency is one of the strongest protections any community can have because it's much harder for questionable decisions to survive when everyone can see how they're being made. Even the violation process changed. Instead of rushing to issue fines, homeowners received warnings, opportunities to correct problems, and a clear path to appeal decisions before penalties were imposed. It wasn't about eliminating standards. It was about applying them fairly and consistently. I still smile every time I think about something simple that happened a few weeks later. My garbage can sat outside until dinner because I completely forgot about it. One of my neighbors laughed, wheeled it back beside my garage, and joked, "Guess we survived another terrible crime." We both laughed harder than the joke probably deserved because, for the first time in years, nobody was afraid that a harmless mistake would turn into another envelope in the mailbox. This is a psychological trap. When people become accustomed to unreasonable authority, they often stop questioning it altogether, convincing themselves that speaking up isn't worth the effort. But accountability doesn't begin with dramatic confrontations. More often, it begins with ordinary people asking ordinary questions and expecting honest answers. The lesson here is, rules are important, communities need structure, and responsible HOA boards can protect neighborhoods in meaningful ways. The problem isn't having rules, it's allowing power to exist without transparency or accountability. If this story reminds you of something you've experienced, I'd love to hear about it. Have you ever lived under an HOA that genuinely improved your neighborhood? Or have you dealt with rules that seem to serve someone's ego more than the community? Share your experience in the comments because every neighborhood has its own story. And sometimes the smallest questions are the ones that uncover the biggest truths. Thanks for watching, and remember, never be afraid to follow the facts wherever they lead, because numbers may not have emotions, but they have an incredible way of telling the truth.